Hi, I wanted to respond to Marcus Epstein and the comments he made while talking to the Young Turks. I have the conversation with the Young Turks in my description box, and I wanted to try and answer some of Epstein's questions. Firstly, he asked in what countries do blacks have lower crime rates than whites? Well, I didn't find a specific statistic for a comparison of whites and blacks for the same country, but I did find this. So check it out. I have my description box, which talks about statistics from Interpol for Ghana. As you know, Ghana is a country in Africa with a large population of blacks, about 21 million. That's about half the number of blacks we have in the United States. And they're squeezed into a country that's less than the size of Arizona. So let's look at their crime statistics. According to Interpol, for murder, the rate per 100,000 people in 2000 was 2.48 for Ghana and 5.51 for the United States. For rape, the rate in 2000 was 6.85 for Ghana, compared with 32.05 for the United States. For larceny, it was 0.08 for Ghana and 2,475.27 for the United States. Ghana overall has an extremely low crime rate for an industrialized nation, while the United States has an extremely high crime rate. So other countries aren't so lucky, and you could talk about populations of blacks in America or uh, Aborigines in Australia. You could talk about even other races such as Muslims, and certain Islamic countries. And you could ask then what could be the problem? Well, as Jenks says, there's a history to this, a history of colonialism and slavery across the globe. For example, ancient African empires during the time of ancient Greece and ancient Rome were considered some of the most peaceful in the world by historians at the time. In ancient Islam, you see that Baghdad was a center of science and education during the time, and they even started the basics of the scientific method as we know it. They no longer thought of science as something you think logically about like Plato did, but actually did experiments to prove their point. And that's really important. So they were really into science. So now let's talk a little bit about science. One side says that genetics is responsible for blacks being more violent and less educated. This is Epstein's position. And the other side, my position, says that the history of slavery leads to poverty, which leads to these discrepancies we see in intelligence and other statistics dealing with crime rates, and so forth. Now, Epstein uses Watson's racial remarks as evidence, but just because Watson said it doesn't make it true. Smart people say dumb things all the time. For example, Lord Kelvin, an extremely intelligent man by any standard, said that the world was only a few thousand years old. Now we know that he's wrong. This is why you need evidence in science. Even James Watson, who invented the genetic code, as Epstein says, doesn't have the right to say things without evidence in science. He even admits that there's no scientific data to support his claim. Now, this is true, and there's a reason for this. This is because single genes very rarely control important things in our body, right? There's Especially for something as complicated as intelligence, it's highly unlikely that single genes would control it. Now, I'm not denying or doubting that genes for intelligence exist. Of course they do. What I'm saying is that you need to prove, you as the the opposition needs to prove how the specific interaction of these certain genes for intelligence causes lower levels of intelligence in blacks than in other races when you disregard environment and other factors. It's a very hard task, but that's what you need to do to prove this point. Furthermore, even if genes for lower intelligence did exist, it's quite likely, then this is not a property that can be solely assigned to blacks. This is because we are all the same species, and we can share our genes. Now, especially for genes that are very subtle, that we can't see, or that requires like specific interaction, as we assume that it will require for intelligence. These genes like spread across populations. So if there is a genes for lower intelligence in blacks, then it's highly likely that that same gene exists in other races. Now, there's the other side, which says that the environment causes most of these problems. Not all of them, most of them, right? And this environment is something we can control, we can pass laws for, right? So it's very important. Now we have evidence for this. There's a study done, which I'll post in my description box, which studies the effect of high cortisol in shrews. Cortisol is a chemical that we release into our bodies when we're stressed. So basically, they really stress these guys out. I don't remember exactly what they did. I think they shocked them or something like that, right? So they're really stressed. And what they found that when there's high levels of cortisol for a long period of time, there's irreversible damage to the hippocampus, which is very important to memory. There were also other cognitive defects, and there are other serious health issues unrelated to intelligence. The thing is, cortisol, high levels of it for long periods of time, acts like an acid, which degenerates your neurons and your cells, and there's very little activity that goes on in those neurons. So, of course, the next step would be to measure cortisol levels in people we assume to be stressed out who are poor. Poor people are probably more likely to be stressed out. And of course, we find that their cortisol levels are extremely high in comparison to people in high socioeconomic status. And I posted this link also to this research paper also in my description box. So one last thing I want you guys to know is this is another reason to vote against the Republicans, because their tax cuts for the rich under Bush widened the gap between the rich and the poor. Uh, O'Reilly says this to Obama very well. He says that the economy increased under Bush, and that's true. But most of that wealth went to the rich, not to the poor. That's the whole reason. That's why people are losing all their jobs. So this means that it's harder for poor people to get out of the cycle. It's already hard for them to begin with because poor people have higher cortisol levels and lower success rates in intelligence exams. But when you're widening the gap, you're making it even harder. So these problems continue to persist in these Bush policies. So